Liebe Zuschauer, dass Investoren wieder Risiko eingehen, war für den Investmentdirektor Paul McNamara bisher das vorherrschende Thema, das dominierende Thema im bisherigen Jahresverlauf. Der leitende Manager bei GAM für den Anleihemarkt und Währungsstrategien in den Schwellenländern meint hier, dass es halt eben da auch so weitergehen kann. Ob das halt tatsächlich so sein kann und vor allem, wie er das Potenzial eben im Anleihe- und Währungsmarkt der Schwellenländer sieht, das möchte ich ihn jetzt fragen. Hello, Mr. McNamara.
Herr McNamara, Sie hatten gesagt, dass die Investoren wieder bereit sind, Risiken einzugehen. Ein beherrschender Trend für den bisherigen Jahresverlauf. Sehen Sie das nach wie vor so?
Of this year, do you still see that?
Yeah, I mean, I distinguish between the idea that risk assets will always go up and the idea that some of the great risks, that the US economy would get sucked into another recession, that the euro would break up, are being increasingly discounted. So I think we've moved to an area, to a time where we're seeing more discrimination between asset classes. We're seeing a willingness to take risks generically. So yes, I would say I think the key development of last year was people are much less worried about the tail risks than they were.
Sie
schauen sich speziell den Anleihen- und Währungsmarkt in den Schwellenländern an. Welches Risiko gehen Sie hier ein?
Are you taking there?
I think the countries we like most are generally the countries which are commodity importers. That I think as growth has slowed down, but also as we've seen people less worried about individual kind of just holding nominal value. We've seen people less inclined to use oil or gold or whatever as investments. So I think this makes us keener on Mexico, Poland, Turkey, and I think less enthusiastic about South America generally or Russia.
So the core markets.
Also Mexiko, Türkei und Polen, das sind die Kernmärkte, die Sie sich anschauen. Wo investieren Sie hier?
Taking there?
We own the currencies, generally speaking. Overall, this doesn't look like a fantastic year for bonds. We have interest rates at very low levels globally, both in the emerging markets and in the developed world. And I really don't think they're going to go much lower. I mean, we have to acknowledge that central banks generally remain extremely dovish. That which I know doesn't play particularly well in Germany, but there is this tendency away from bonds. I think that currencies in EM are the core of our investments for this year.
How long do you think will this liquidity?
Wie lange wird diese hohe Liquidität am Markt noch existieren?
How long will that take?
I mean, I think we're going to see liquidity for a long, long time. I mean, central banks globally, are doing the job of trying to get growth going again. That if you look in every single country, we're seeing fiscal policy is not particularly supportive of growth. I think from Japan, where it hasn't worked particularly well. But we're seeing loose money everywhere, both in the developed world and in emerging markets, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So it's not that we're anticipating a big rise in interest rates anywhere else. It's much more that we think that this approach is very much in the price of everything we look at, and that currencies are more unpredictable, that they're much more likely to be a good source of returns going forward than bonds.
So what is your
Welches Währungspaar ist für Sie momentan am attraktivsten?
At the moment?
I mean, I think our single favourite currency at the moment is the Mexican peso. I mean, despite the fact that it's had a very good run, the fundamentals are in place. The strongest currencies in the medium term have been places like Poland and Turkey, where something has fundamentally changed, where we've seen strong productivity improvements, and everything we're seeing out of Mexico kind of supports the view that something similar has gone on there. Despite the strength of the currency, we've seen a recovery in the trade balance in Mexico. It's also very much oriented towards the US, which I think is going to be the great support for growth in the world economy in the year ahead.
How much of euro do you?
Wie viel Euro haben Sie in Ihrem Fonds?
In your fund?
We don't tend to invest in the euro, but I mean it's important to us as a support for the Polish zloty, the Hungarian forint, the Romanian leu. I think we still have issues at the periphery. That if you look at Spain, if you look at Italy, the single biggest swing factor in the global economy is going to be what happens in Spain and Italy, and of course we're very focused on what happens to growth in those two countries. At the moment, I think it would be fair to say we're not especially optimistic. We're certainly not looking for an implosion, but I think the recent data does suggest that the recovery is taking longer in these countries, and that suggests that the dollar is still going to be, in terms of global currency blocks, the currency of choice going forward.
Sehen Sie das Risiko, dass der Euro auseinanderbrechen könnte?
I don't think the euro will fall apart. I think the move in Cyprus to a more bail-in driven, although it's clearly very popular in the core and very popular in Germany, and I think in the medium term it's probably inevitable. I think that that if we do move to the stage where we're going to see bail-ins, not just in Cyprus but maybe in Spain or Italy, that would be a huge test for the euro going forward. So, I mean, we're almost certain that the euro will continue, that it will be quite a strong currency, but we have to be aware of the tail risk there.
Sie sprachen von einer starken Währung. Wo sehen Sie den Euro am Ende des Jahres?
I mean, I think we have to get through what's going on in Spain and Italy at the moment. If we see weak growth, that's less important in its own right than in terms of what it means for the banking systems of Spain and Italy. If we have a protracted period of slow growth, obviously that's going to be very negative for the assets which, in particular, the Spanish banks own. So on that basis, I think that's going to be negative for the euro going forward, and I think not necessarily for year end, but I think we'll see 135 before we'll see 125 before we see 135.
Zurück zu Ihrem Fonds. Sie haben gesagt, der mexikanische Peso ist einer Ihrer favorisierten Währungen. Welche sind es außerdem noch?
Again, we're sticking to the currencies which will benefit, whose terms of trade will benefit from weaker commodities. So that leads us to favour Mexican peso, as I said, Polish zloty, Turkish lira, Thai baht, and maybe to underweight Colombian peso, Peruvian sol, Russian ruble. So overall, we're swinging to the manufacturing countries which will benefit, whose terms of trade will benefit from cheaper commodities.
Looking at the bond market,
wo sind Sie am Anleihenmarkt investiert?
There?
Overall, I think the biggest theme in our bond market positions is that we're relatively positive on inflation-linked bonds. Not because we're expecting a big spike in inflation, but we want to be relatively conservative. As I said, I think we've seen very low interest rates for a very long time. I think that will continue for some time, but it's very much in the price. Bonds are expensive because people think that central banks will never hike again. I think that's probably maybe got a little bit overblown. Generally speaking, we're quite conservative on bonds. We're not particularly enthusiastic on buying long-duration assets, and where we are buying duration, we prefer inflation-linked debt.
Wo sehen Sie das größte Risiko für Ihre Investments momentan?
I mean, I think the biggest risk for all investors globally is going to be the European periphery. I think if it's badly handled, an attempt to bail in a Spanish or Italian bank could go very wrong very quickly. So I think the European periphery, although our core view is that things will be resolved successfully in Europe, if something goes very wrong in the world economy, it's almost certainly going to be in Europe.
You said it might take longer than expected.
Sie haben gesagt, dass eine Besserung der Lage in Europa länger dauern wird als erwartet. Wie lang wird das sein?
You think which time will it take?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, all we can do is watch the growth numbers. Everything comes down to growth. If we get, to a stage where we see the Spanish economy growing by 2%, the Italian economy growing by 2%, which it hasn't for a very long time, then I think it'll be time to be positive again. But it won't be this year, and I kind of suspect it won't be next year either.
Was denken Sie, wo die größten Risiken für die globale Konjunktur liegen?
So it still comes back to Europe. Once you move beyond Europe, I think things are essentially dropping into place. In the US, if you look what people are doing in terms of their revisions to the fiscal deficit in Germany, they're coming down in the US, they're coming down very rapidly, which is something that we haven't seen for a long time. Emerging markets, which are my specialist area, I think look relatively healthy. That emerging growth is going to price off growth in the developed world, but with relatively low debt levels, with relatively conservative banks, emerging markets are not really where the risk is. I think once we get past the risks in the European periphery, I think that people might sort of look around and be quite surprised how positive the global outlook is.
Are you worried
Macht Ihnen das langsamere Wachstum in Asien Sorgen?
Asian countries?
Not especially, because I think the banks in Asia are relatively conservatively run. They tend to have more deposits than loans, so you don't have that source of instability. That these are economies which are much better positioned than the Western economies were in 2008, 2009 to face lower growth. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get fantastic returns out of the currency or fantastic returns out of the equities, but it does mean that you're not going to get these extraordinary risks, these huge moves that we saw in 2008. So I think trundling ahead is quite acceptable for the moment.
So do you still see
Sehen Sie die Schwellenländer als Gewinner der momentanen Situation?
The situation we have right now?
Not necessarily a winner, but certainly a safe haven. That if things go badly in the world, they will go less badly for emerging markets. In a way, the key risk for emerging markets is that things get resolved very quickly. That if it suddenly turns out that the growth numbers out of the European periphery look a bit stronger, then the only thing in the world you're going to want to own are European equities and the euro, and then suddenly emerging markets. I think then we will underperform what's going on here. So. To a certain degree, I think the key risk for us is that things go well.
Mr. McNamara, thank you so much for the interview. Ja, und liebe Zuschauer, das war es dann auch schon wieder mit einem weiteren DRF-Interview hier vom Parkett Emerging Markets, also als sicherer Hafen und als Investmentchance. Ich sage danke, dass Sie dabei waren bei diesem Interview. Hoffe, Sie zum nächsten wieder begrüßen zu können. Und bis dahin sage ich erstmal Tschüss.